We traveled to Williamsburg, Virginia on Friday to speak with Robert Gates, the former defense secretary and CIA director, who is now the chancellor at William and Mary. We began on the question of America's leadership and how the domestic dysfunction over the debt ceiling might undermine it.
I think it's a real problem. It feeds the narrative from China in particular that our system doesn't work. That it's broken, it's paralyzed, it can't get things done, that their model is more stable and actually more effective than ours. So sort of having these episodes of great crisis and then some solution at the last second really feeds a notion that the U.S. political system isn't working at all.
What do you think the biggest threat to the United States is right now?
I think it is the polarization in the country. And you know, we've always had polarization in America, but what's been different more recently is not just a measure of paralysis, as indicated by the debt ceiling, but a level of meanness and a lack of civility among our politicians. The sense that somebody who disagrees with you is not just somebody you disagree with, but is an enemy, is a bad person. This lack of civility is I think, something new and really is pretty pervasive in the Congress, and it sets a pretty bad example for the rest of the country.
We're now over 2 years into the Biden administration, and no cabinet member has traveled to China to date. There are some signs that there may be a bit of a thaw coming here, but the two presidents need to talk. What has to happen before they can get on the phone to each other?
Well, I was encouraged by the day-long talks that the National Security Advisor had with his Chinese counterpart a week or so ago in Vienna. Our ambassador, Nick Burns, is now being allowed to see some more senior officials than he's been able to see in the past. But this lack of communication is a real problem. You know, even in the worst days of the Cold War, we had the hotline with the Soviets, and then even in the 90s with the Russians. We had agreements on how to deal with incidents, like incidents at sea, and how to make sure they didn't escalate and get out of control. We don't have any of those kinds of communications with the Chinese today. So my highest priority, frankly, would be direct communications link between our commanders in Hawaii and the Chinese commanders in eastern China. But it's also important for the leaders to talk and to begin to figure out, you know, we are going to be in this contest for a long time, and let's just face that reality.
Recently, Beijing reportedly appointed their state security czar to start cracking down on U.S. firms that do business in China. It's getting tough.
It is
on
tough.
That front.
And what Xi Jinping made very clear at the Party Congress a few months ago was that security was going to trump the economy.
Isn't
in
it
China.
Incredible?
Well, for him, it's all about the power, maintaining and sustaining the power of the Communist Party of China. And that's his highest priority, and he is willing to sacrifice economic growth for that.
Japan's prime minister said Ukraine today, maybe East Asia tomorrow. It seems to be there's this increased reference to Taiwan or some kind of military expansion by China as looming, as almost inevitable. Do you see the potential for a head-to-head clash here, or are we thinking of it incorrectly?
Well, there's always that potential. I mean, the Chinese have been building ships like crazy. They now have more ships in the Pacific than we do, and they're still building. So I think we have to take it very seriously, and I think the disparity in the size of our navies, even though our ships may be bigger and better technologically, at a certain point, the numbers really matter.
You famously said that Joe Biden was wrong on foreign policy for 40 years, and I know you get asked about this all the time, but at this point in his presidency, how do you assess his performance?
Well, first of all, on the thing that's most important right now, which is Ukraine, I think that the way that the administration used intelligence to alert the Europeans and others to what the Russians were about to do was very important. And I think the way that the administration was able to assemble the alliance, bring the alliance together in support of Ukraine has been very impressive. My problem is that they have been, I think, slow in approving the various kinds of weapon systems going to the Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, there's a debate for a long time. Do we send tanks? Well, finally we sent tanks. Do we send things like the HIMARS and other kinds of capabilities? And we finally did it, but only after months and months of indecision. So
and now it's F-16s.
They've been worrying about, talking about F-16s for many, many months, and now we hear, well, we're gonna go ahead and allow the training on the F-16s. Well, that's a decision that could have been made 6 months ago. Truth is, if they had begun training pilots on F-16s 6 months ago, then those pilots would be able to get into those airplanes this spring. I understand the need to avoid a direct confrontation with the Russians. But I think we learned pretty early on that as long as we weren't providing things that could attack Russia proper, that Putin was not going to retaliate.
A year ago when we spoke, you told me the one glimmer of hope you saw was that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin had united Democrats and Republicans in Washington. There was strong consensus. Do you actually think that's holding? I
do. I think that, in fact, there's kind of a competition on the Hill to see who can be tougher on China. And it makes a more nuanced policy by the administration more difficult, because anything that the administration does to try and put a floor on this relationship gets criticized on the Hill as conceding something to the Chinese. But I think by and large, there is very broad bipartisan support for what the U.S. is doing for Ukrainians, and I think it's also in terms of China.
Yet there are some loud voices raising concerns about U.S. military readiness in terms of drawing down, in particular, U.S. stockpiles to quickly provide arms to Ukraine or to Taiwan, and the connection to this concept that weakens the United States. Donald Trump said last week, we're giving away so much equipment, we don't have ammunition for ourselves right now, we're giving away too much.
The kinds of equipment we're giving the Ukrainians for this ground war against Russia are not necessarily the kinds of weapons we would rely on if we ended up in a confrontation, for example, with China. I think there also is a realization that we have let our production capabilities wither since the end of the Cold War, and finally people are getting behind the notion we're going to have to make some long-term investments there.
I think there is an interesting conversation, though, about America's role in the world, and we're seeing some of the Republican candidates in particular take some pretty different positions on this. Do you think where a candidate stands on this issue of Russia and Ukraine really should matter to people at home? Like, what does it say about the candidates?
Well, I think it should matter. I think it's very important where a candidate stands on issues related to core national security interests. And
because you believe Ukraine is core to U.S. national security
absolutely,
interests.
because if we have these NATO obligations. If Vladimir Putin wins in Ukraine, there's no doubt in my mind that Moldova is next, that Belarus will be incorporated into the original Russian Empire, which is what Putin's trying to recreate. And it creates great danger to the Baltic states and to Poland, where we have treaty alliances that would require American forces to confront the Russians. So I think this is important. And there are differences of view, and frankly, there are some differences of view on these issues in the Democratic Party as well.
The Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, testified that the U.S. assessment is that Vladimir Putin is, quote, very unlikely to use a tactical nuclear weapon. But the bravado continues. Do you still have concern that this could escalate, or are we entering this sort of slow, grinding war of attrition?
Well, I think that the chances of Putin using a tactical nuclear weapon are not zero, but they're very, very low. And the potential for NATO's retaliation, NATO wouldn't retaliate with a tactical nuclear weapon, but it would engage Russia much more directly, I think, if there were the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. He also has his partner without limits, Xi Jinping, twice publicly telling him not to use tactical nuclear weapons. So there's no money in it for Putin. I think that the risk of a significant escalation on the part of the Russians is pretty limited at this point.
But not necessarily at a point where we're tipping towards negotiation.
I personally think that negotiations are pretty far in the future. I think this fight will continue, and particularly, I mean, either way, if the counteroffensive is really successful or if it's not, the fighting will continue until one side or the other is exhausted. And Putin's bet is that he can outlast the Ukrainians, outlast the Europeans, and outlast us. And Xi Jinping is watching this very carefully. So this is another reason, I think, for us to stay the course in supporting the Ukrainians.
I want to ask you a little bit about something you said last year when I was asking you about the state of the country. You said it would concern you if President Trump ran for office again. He is currently the front runner for the Republican nomination. What's your level of concern now?
Well, I'm concerned because, among other things, because he has been very clear that he wants to dramatically change, if not dismantle, some major institutions in the American government. And, you know, my attitude for a long time has been many of the institutions in our government need dramatic reform. But those institutions are critical to the preservation of our democracy, preservation of our economic well-being, and frankly, our freedom.
What does this next 2-year period look like for us?
Well, the interesting thing to me is the polls that suggest that significant majorities of the American people across the board would rather have two very different candidates for president than the choice they're likely to be given.
Is there any glimmer of hope there that you see on the horizon, or new talent?
I think there are several caucuses in the House, in particular, that are looking for ways to have more pragmatic problem solving in Congress, to have more bipartisanship. I think it's got to start. We can't start solving some of these big problems until we have some restoration of civility and where people actually respect each other.
Well, thank you for the civil conversation today, Mr. Secretary.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.
You can watch the full interview with Robert Gates on our website, facethenation.com, and on our YouTube channel. We'll be back in a moment.